I'm Cassandra Hemingway, and I'm the outreach manager at the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District. And with me today is Theron Laysleeper. He's on our outreach team as well. We'll be co-presenting Backyard Compost Basics. I have a couple things we have to review before we get started. One is that we are a local solid waste management district that's a union municipality made up of 19 member towns within the Central Vermont area in the US. We have folks from all over the world logged on today or registered. So I just want people to know that while all of the information about composting is applicable wherever you are, any information about our local Vermont food scrap management laws or some of the information is even more specific to our area within Vermont. So this is really for our district, but some of the information is applicable anywhere. The other thing I want folks to know is that we are partially funded for this webinar series by the USDA, United States US Department of Agriculture, sorry, and their Rural Utility Services provides grants to rural areas, and we are operating with some grant funding to pay for our time and our resources to provide these webinars. So thanks to the USDA for that. Lastly, we have a couple of housekeeping tips. Pardon me. One is, I think we're all fairly familiar with Zoom by now, but I want to point out that we do have a Q&A. So if you have questions specific to our presentation, questions about composting or anything that we're presenting, please put that in the Q&A box. If it's different, if it's a chat, if it's an item where you want to share something you know that we didn't mention or a comment, please put that into the chat box. But we will be looking mainly to the Q&A box to answer questions. We also do stop throughout the presentation. We'll stop a couple times to catch up on questions, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. We will try to get to everybody's questions, but we may have to, some of the questions will be similar, so we may answer those like questions as one answer. The other thing that's already come up, we will be recording this webinar. I think we're recording right now, and you will all get a copy of it in your emails afterward. So you'll have a recording you can look at later or share with people you know. We have somebody with a raised hand. If you have a comment, just put it in the chat box. And Theron, can you introduce yourself before we get started?
Hi, everybody. My name is Theron, and I'm the outreach coordinator here at the district. And I've been composting my whole life in different ways. So I'm excited to share some of that experience with you, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions and get some troubleshooting done if you are currently composting and need help with it.
Okay, let's get started. So I'm just going to briefly go over this overview, and then we'll get started. So today, here's what we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of reasons why folks compost, and we'll go over that, and you might throw in the chat box if your reason is a little bit different than what we say. We actually will talk a little bit about what compost is, because if you understand what comprises compost, you will understand how to effectively manage a compost system. And it's actually much simpler than some folks might think. But it's really helpful to know what are the things that make up compost, and then you know how to deal with it. And then we'll spend a big chunk of time in the middle of the presentation just reviewing different kinds of compost systems, the pros and cons, and give you some ideas of different ways you could set up a system or maybe tweak one you already have. We'll talk about some recipes. I mean, basically there's one recipe you'll find out, but we'll go into more depth about that. And we end with some basic upkeep, and we'll spend quite a bit of time at the end talking about animals, bears, rodents, mammals, all the things that people are concerned about getting into their bins. We will go into depth about how to avoid that. But really everything you're going to learn in the next hour is going to teach you that anyway, but then we'll just go through a few more tips at the end. So you ready to start?
All right, so yeah, so there are a lot of reasons to compost, but one of the reasons that we are diverting food scraps in Vermont is because we have a, a provision in the universal recycling law that bans food scraps from the trash. That that was recently passed on to everybody in the state. Large generators have been required to divert for a while, but generally speaking, about 20% of the trash that we generate is food scraps. And food scraps in the trash, well, they smell because they're rotting and they're not decomposing properly. If you are composting them, it helps manage that. It also helps manage some of the issues that arise when you put food scraps in the landfill. One of those is that those food scraps will decompose anaerobically without the presence of air, and that creates methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and it contributes very, very heavily to global warming. So that's one of the state's efforts to reduce our impact, and food scraps is just one part of that. At home, you may have a number of motivations to compost, whether that's just managing your food scraps so you don't have to pay to get rid of them, whether it's creating compost for your garden to amend your soil and improve your growing conditions. So you can think about that, and you may have multiple motivations. Like I said, methane is about 30 times as powerful as a heat trapping gas than CO2. And so it's a good thing that we are, as a state, working to keep our food scraps out of the landfill and manage them properly and process them back into soil where they can be put to higher and better use. So I mentioned briefly the universal recycling law in the state of Vermont. This covers businesses and individuals. It's covered businesses for a while in terms of food scraps. And just this summer, July 1st, all residents of the state have been required to keep their food scraps out of the trash. So to accommodate that, there are a number of things you can do. You can compost them in your backyard. You can also bring them to drop-off sites such as transfer stations, commercial composters, or community compost sites. Some of your neighbors who compost may also be willing to take your food scraps. I know that Cassandra has a neighbor that gives their food scraps to her. And then every transfer station in the state is accepting food scraps now. So those are all picked up by commercial composters. Some businesses also provide curbside hauling, but that's generally limited to the more urban areas, and it's a little trickier if you're out in the country. But then there are other options for you other than curbside. Meat and bones are exempt from this diversion requirement. You can still put those in the trash in Vermont, or we'll talk about some other ways to manage those. And you can also bring those to those commercial compost drop-off sites. Those can be processed effectively in those large-scale facilities, and they won't be an issue with attracting animals. So this is a food scrap drop-off that is just outside of Montpelier. This is at Vermont Compost, and this is generally what a food scrap drop-off would look like. You'll have these big totes, and sometimes there'll be another tote with something like wood shavings to cover the food scraps so that absorbs some of the smell and some of the moisture and keeps things like bugs down. So when we're talking about compost, we are talking about something that is no longer food scraps. It's almost entirely decomposed and decayed. You see this person holding this composted material in their hands. It looks like a rich soil, and you can't identify really any sort of food scraps in it. That's because it's been, at this point, pretty much fully processed. It is nutrient rich, and it's really good fertilizer for anything that grows. You can put it on lawns, you can put it on gardens, you can put it on potted house plants, and all of those things will benefit from having some of these processed nutrients available to it. So to create this compost, it is a process, and it's going to be a combination of materials that go into this. This is going to be a combination of nitrogen, which we call greens, and carbon, which we call browns. We'll get into more information about what those are a little bit later. But one of the important things to remember is that if you're buying finished compost from a hardware store, for example, that is a value-added product. It's not just somebody's old food scraps. It's also the labor required to pick those up. It's the other inputs like the carbon, the wood chips, or whatever else they're mixing in. It's the mixing and the processing and the monitoring and the testing that goes into creating this finished product. So, compost is alive. Yes, it is. It is full of these little microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, bugs, insects. All of these organisms and microorganisms work to process the materials that you put into your compost and break them down into that finished product that you saw in the previous slide. These organisms use oxygen to do that. They breathe oxygen just like us, and they are very effective at breaking down these food scraps into this compost. And there are a lot of them. In a teaspoon of soil, there are between 100 million and 1 billion of these microorganisms, and in compost, it's even higher. These are some magnified drawings of some of the microorganisms that exist in the compost. And as I said, these organisms are aerobic. They need oxygen. The compost or the food scraps and the other inputs that you're putting in are their food. So they need the food, they need air, and then they also need water. You need to really think of your compost system as a pet almost. And it requires these 3 inputs, food, air, and water, just like a pet, to thrive and to work effectively to break down those materials that you're trying to turn into compost. So, like I said, the food is going to be your greens and your browns. Greens are generally your food scraps. Browns are a carbon input like wood shavings. Air, to introduce air into your pile, the best way to do that is to turn it with a stick or a digging fork or something like that. And that will create air channels for some of those bugs to crawl around in. It'll also make sure things aren't stuck together, and it'll just make it easier to break it up. Think of it as like chewing. You know, you're processing the materials so that they are easier to digest. And then water is also important. If it gets too dry, it won't process as quickly, but if it gets too wet, it won't process properly because there won't be enough air in it. So it's striking a balance between these two ends of the spectrum. Generally speaking, the best ratio and the recipe that we are going for in our compost systems is 2 to 3 times the volume of carbon to 1 part the volume of nitrogen. So that means that for every bucket of food scraps that you add to your compost system, you should be adding 2 to 3 buckets of something that's high in carbon like wood shavings. That is the ideal ratio for those organisms and microorganisms. That will create an environment in which they can thrive, and it'll provide them with the necessary nutrients to continue breaking these materials down and quickly turn them into that finished compost that we are really looking for. So that's a basic overview of the process. Cassandra is going to talk to us a little bit about different systems we can use, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what goes in and what stays out, and we'll follow up with some troubleshooting and animal control.
Thank you, Theron. I'm going to just clarify a couple points, and we have a couple questions too. One thing I want to clarify is how do food scraps turn into methane in the landfill? And this is really relevant because that is not what happens when we're composting. And the reason is, if you remember that image that Theron showed when he was talking about methane, it shows these giant, it's hard to tell the scale, but these are giant compactors. And every time a load is dumped in the landfill, these compactors come and just compact it down. They're trying to get as much material into that space as possible. But in that compaction process, there's no air in there. So it's anaerobic. And when organics such as food scraps, leaf and yard waste, wood, paper even, when those are in an anaerobic environment, as they decompose, they release methane. And when they're in an aerobic environment, such as a compost pile or even just like on the ground, then when they decompose, there are trace amounts of methane, but primarily they're releasing a very small amount of carbon dioxide, but nothing to the scale of what happens in a landfill. So it is a really big difference in how food scraps break down that affects the gases that are being released. I wanted to just mention that point because that is a big reason why we are working around this law, and we're training folks to compost. Another question that came up is somebody wants to know about processing meat and bones, and that is something we will talk about. You'll find out as we go further in, we don't recommend that people put meat and bones in your actual backyard compost pile. But if you are dropping off your food scraps at a commercial facility, in Vermont, that would be in a transfer station, or we have commercial composters where you can drop off food scraps. Or if you're getting your food scraps picked up, eventually they're going to a commercial scale composter. Theron, I think you need to not touch the chat or Q&A boxes, otherwise the presentation is going to keep getting screwy. That we have, sorry everyone, we have a presentation. We're doing Prezi, so sometimes it's a little bit glitchy if the person running the show tries to get off of the Prezi. Meat and bones are fine to drop off to commercial scale composters because those are going into systems that can handle them, that will get hot enough to kill pathogens. That's not going to happen in your backyard compost, not unless you are, spending a lot of time creating the right conditions. This is a Compost Basics webinar. We are not going to go into details about how to compost thermophilic composting or hot composting. We don't expect that in most backyard systems. So, and you'll see we'll go into more depth, but for your backyard compost, we recommend keeping meat and bones out. Theron, here's a question. Somebody says they are seeing maggots in their kitchen scraps. Are maggots okay? You want to take that one?
Yes, maggots are okay. And that is something that you may see once in a while. Those are the larvae from flies. So that means that flies have been accessing your food scraps and laying eggs in them. If you're seeing maggots and you don't want to, I would recommend taking your food scraps out to the compost bin more frequently and giving your compost bin or pail, whatever you're using to collect your food scraps in your kitchen, give it a wash. That'll keep them down, and you won't have to see them.
Okay, so there's several more questions that we're going to be addressing. Most of those are around browns. So I just wanted to point out that Theron's introduction to composting was so that you would understand that what you're dealing with is a system that's alive, that there are trillions of microorganisms that require food, air, and water, that you want 3 times as many browns as greens in order to give them that right ratio. And now knowing all of that, we're going to talk about how that happens within a compost system. So some of the questions about like how to get browns, is paper okay? Is cardboard okay? We will get into that. But and Theron will be having a whole section about that after this. So let's start talking about compost systems and then we'll get to those questions. So can you go to the next slide, please, Theron? So before you decide what you want for your compost system, whether it's a backyard bin, a green cone, or a tumbler, whatever you choose, or your own homemade bin, or if you already have a compost system, but you want to change it because it's not working for some reason, or maybe not working for you, it's really important to just take stock of what your situation is. Because if it's going to be successful, it has to work for you. It can't work for somebody down the street who has 5 times as much energy as you or more space. It has to work for where you are and what your goals are, what you have for time, and how much energy you have. Space is a huge consideration. If you're in an apartment, you probably aren't going to have a composting option. Also, your goals. Some of you, let's see a show of hands, click the raise the hand button. If you are composting because you have a garden and you want the compost for your garden. That's one of the many very common goals. Lots of people, the numbers are just ticking up. We're at, I think we have, see, it keeps changing, but I think the majority of you are composting because you want the compost for your garden. Let's stop doing that and raise your hand if you're composting because you just want to keep your food scraps out of the trash, whether it's because there's a local law or because it's really stinky when it goes in your trash, or whatever your reason is. Yeah, so there's a bunch of people, your goal is really more about just keeping food scraps out of the trash. We're at maybe about a third of the folks here, maybe a little bit more, just want to make sure that they're not getting their food scraps in the landfill for whatever reason. So that's important to know. As you learn about these compost systems, some of them are going to be better for creating a really nice product for your garden. Some of them are going to work better if your goal is to just keep stuff out of the landfill. And some of them will cover both. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start talking about some of the most common systems. I apologize for the low quality of this photo. It just gives you a basic idea of a store-bought composter. This one is called a soil saver. It's the kind that most of the solid waste management entities in Vermont have available to residents. Typically, we sell them at cost or just barely above cost. But you can get any sort of version of this at most farm and garden stores or online. There's pros and cons to them. One of the things I like about them are that if you're ready to compost, this is a quick and easy way to get started. And you can usually get one for in the $100 range or less, sometimes a little more. And they take about 20 minutes to set up, depending on your capability with tools and all that, but it's not really a complicated thing to set up. The other thing is that if you're living in a neighborhood, it creates sort of an enclosed area where your food scraps go. So it's fair to your neighbors that, you have everything contained. So there are some nice pros to it. In a reasonable cost, quick and easy setup, and you can get started right away. If you take this webinar, go out and get a compost bin, you could be starting composting by tonight. There are some cons also, and one of the cons is also a pro, which is that if you can see in this image, this is kind of like the marketing image for the company that sells them. So first of all, let's just get this out of the way. That little image of the door being lifted up with the perfect black, absolutely consistent looking compost spilling out of it loosely, that's just a marketing image. That is not what really happens in a compost bin. You would never have perfect compost like that unless you're filtering it out afterward and you're screening it, which some folks do, some don't. But you might have, but it's going to be compacted at the bottom of the bin. It's not going to spill out once you lift that door. But that's fine. That's just a marketing image. But the other thing is, if you notice, it's hard to tell in this image, but at the bottom of the bin, that's just sitting on bare ground. There's no bottom to the bin, and that's a good thing because remember, Theron pointed out that there's somewhere between 100 million and a trillion microorganisms in a teaspoon of soil. So when you have your food scraps and your browns going onto bare, direct soil, that it's basically inoculating your compost, and right away the magic's going to happen. Those microorganisms are going to get to work on your food scraps because they have direct access to the soil and they have direct access to the microorganisms. So that's good. It's not good because macroorganisms, larger animals like raccoon, skunk, rats, whatever, they can just dig under and pop up right inside your bin. So even though the Soil Saver is sold plain, just sitting on the ground, I would recommend that you pair with your purchase of a Soil Saver, also get some hardware cloth. And hardware cloth is a very stiff meshed screen that you can get in a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, or even inch mesh. For composting, you're best off with a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch screen. And for a composter like this, all you need to do is get a piece that is about 8 to 10 inches bigger around than the bottom of your bin. So you want to just lay it on the ground and set the bin on top of it. It can be really helpful if you take out an inch or two of sod so it's settled in a little bit, but you want to make sure that hardware cloth is sticking out around the edges of the bin. So when an animal tries to dig down, they can't. And if they get underneath, they can't come up inside of it. So that's the fix for that open bottom. The other thing about a Soil Saver is, remember, the microorganisms need food, air, and water. So the food is going to be your food scraps and your browns. The air is in an open pile, it's going to come in through the sides, and you're also going to have to aerate it. We will talk more about how to do that later. But in this Soil Saver, there is some aeration. You can kind of see it. It's a low quality photo, but there are like very tiny little vent holes you can sort of see in this photo. Those vent holes are inadequate for actual aeration. It's better than nothing, but what you really see is a wall of black plastic. So that's a con to this kind of a bin. So if you're going to look for a pre-made bin, look for what they have for aeration in the sides. And if it isn't really adequate, that's okay. It just means you got to make sure you're going to be doing the aerating. And it's not a huge job. It doesn't have to happen every week or every day. It doesn't even have to happen every other week, but you'll just have to know that there isn't natural aeration happening. So you're going to have to get in there with a pitchfork or a compost aerating tool or even a stick and make sure that you are aerating the pile. And the other piece is you may want to consider using 2 Soil Savers over time because, especially to get through the winter, 1 Soil Saver, they rarely fill all the way up for a single household, but if you have a couple households joining in, or if you're just using 1 bin, as you get into the winter, everything will freeze and the composting process just stops. It doesn't happen when it's freezing. So all of your food scraps will freeze and then it will pile up. But if you get a second bin, you can make sure that one's empty over the winter and fill that up over the winter, and then including adding your browns. And then you turn it and aerate it in the spring. So it's ideal to have more than 1, but if you're just getting started, it's fine to start with 1. So if you have questions about Soil Savers, put them in the Q&A box, and we're going to move on and talk about some other, and I say Soil Saver, but really I mean any pre-made bin. They're pretty straightforward, but there's a couple things to know for managing. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so I always weigh whether or not we should keep this slide in here, because on the one hand, let's do the show of hands again. Just raise your hand if you currently compost with an open pile, or if you ever have. And I know if Theron's video is on, his hand would be up too. I personally only composted in an open pile for most of my life, up until the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I guess. No, longer than that, maybe like 15 years. Years go by fast now. So we had quite a few people raising their hand. I want you to know that it's legitimately composting if you're in an open pile. I've had people say, I don't really compost, I just throw it in a pile. Well, actually you're composting. Just because it's less work or passive doesn't mean that it's not composting. But it does mean that it's not a great idea, especially if you live, well, pretty much whether you live in rural or urban setting. It's one of the things I really like about open pile composting is you get that natural aeration. If you look at this pile, you can see how the air will just go right in through the sides, and it will actually move its way up through the center of the pile and right up through the top. The other thing is it's very easy to turn it. It's all right there. You don't have to deal with the walls of a bin or hardware cloth. However, it's also an open buffet for wild animals. And it's discouraged by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and I would imagine other fish and wildlife departments around the country. It's particularly dangerous if you have dogs or pets that are attracted to the compost pile, because there is a neurotoxin on some decomposing food, not all. It's on some of the molds that develop on decomposing foods that can be deadly. And you see this bullet point down here, Mabel the dog. Mabel is a golden retriever dog from Montpelier in our town here in Vermont that was eating out of an open compost pile and died within 2 days from that deadly neurotoxin that was on decomposing food. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's something that can happen. So between wanting to keep pets safe and wanting to minimize wildlife coming into neighborhoods, we agree with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife that open piles are not a good idea, especially in Vermont where we already had around 60% of our residents composting, and that number has increased dramatically since our residential food scrap landfill ban went into place on July 1st. So it's really important that if you're going to be composting, you compost correctly and minimize any access to animals. So yes, this is a legitimate way to compost, but please don't do it. And if you're doing it now, we're going to show you some ways to quickly enclose that pile. Next slide. So we're going to jump ahead to a system that's a little bit more complicated, but really, I think, maybe the best way. If it's not for everybody, when you think about, your goals, and your time and your energy, and I maybe ought to have added to that list your budget. This is a system that's great for somebody who maybe has a little more of a budget or more time or building skills or and really wants to compost everything. And maybe even if you have a garden or a lawn where you want to distribute it, or if you have like 3 or 4 neighbors contributing to your bin. This is either a 2 or 3 bin system. The setup takes time. It can take a day or 2 to build with regular, like not, working throughout the day to build one of these, or you may need somebody more skilled than you are if you're not skilled with construction. It is, however, I believe the most effective way to compost because it just creates a system that makes it easy to turn your compost when it needs to turn, to get the browns on it and keep it enclosed. So let's go to the next slide and we're going to show you how these work. And that we're looking at the slide of the 3 bin. I just want to start by saying this is way too much for one person's backyard. Unless you are a farm or you have like a bunch of neighbors all contributing to the same system, or you have a huge family, or this is really more the kind of setup, like we put systems similar to this in our community compost sites. We have set up 5 community composting sites in the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District, and each one of them got a Jora tumbler, which we'll talk about in a minute, and one of these 3 bin compost system. And that's for sites where we had anywhere from 10 apartment units to 40. So that's the number of people we're thinking of who would contribute to a bin this size. But just to give you the idea of how it works, and these 3 compartments, you can see in this image that they are separated by hardware cloth. For those of you who weren't familiar with hardware cloth, you might see, it might make sense now. Everybody's probably seen it somewhere. And so that allows for the aeration and it also keeps animals out. It's very effective against rodents and small mammals especially. And you can see that the whole back of this bin is just hardware cloth and the sides. So it's really allows for natural aeration. Then each bin has a different function. Some people do it differently, but the way that one way that works is you designate one bin where you're just that's the active bin. That's where you're adding your fresh materials, your fresh green food scraps, your garden waste, whatever. It all goes into that one bin. And for this conversation, we're just going to call it that bin all the way on the left. If you go a little further to the left of that, you see that image of it's a cylinder fence and it's holding leaves. It looks like it may even just be the dropped leaves from that tree. Those are the browns. And that's one way to manage your browns, is to just, rake up leaves and have them available. I want to point out that this is the first image you've seen, I think, where the part of your compost system, I said, if you're thinking about setting up a compost system or fixing an old one, make sure you have hardware cloth, because that's what you need to keep animals out. But also make sure you have something that you have designated that is directly next to your bin where you're keeping your browns, whether that's wood shavings or mulch hay or animal bedding or dropped leaves. Have a container right there for those things. Because if you don't set that up as part of your compost system, it will be really hard to make sure you get the correct ratio of 2 to 3 times as many browns to greens. So those are right there. Every time you add your food scraps into that first bin on the left, you add 2 or 3 times as many leaves. And when that's full, or full might mean literally half or 3/4, then you just, these boards are actually slats so they can slide out, and you can use your pitchfork to turn all the material into the middle bin, cover it with leaves, and now it's resting and it's just working, it's active, but you don't have to do anything to it. You've turned it, you've aerated it, and it's resting. And then you just keep doing that. So the next time you fill up the bin all the way on the left, you turn everything in the middle into the third bin on the right, you turn everything in the left into the middle bin, and you start fresh. And the third bin all the way on the right is the finished compost, or we might say that's curing, which is the final process where you let your compost sit. After it's done, you let it sit for another month or 2, and then it just completes the process entirely, and it's ready to use. So some people do it differently. Some people will just keep all their material in one bin, and when that fills up, they'll turn it and let it rest, and then they'll start filling up the second bin. But that's the idea. Having that place to move your material from one bin to the next is really key to managing the materials effectively and in a way that does not attract animals. I will say that what I just described is a process that might take a year or more, depending on how much material you have. Next slide. So this is a more reasonable size for a backyard, and that's Theron over there on the right and Jan on the left. Those two built that system. Theron designed it. He used some existing plans and then edited them and revised them to make a bin that works for a single family or a couple families in their backyard. Same idea, you just only need 2. I think this is probably more of a realistic size if you're just a household. The 3 bin is just way too big for most households. So they built this, we videotaped it. If you go to our website, and you'll see a link to it at the end of the presentation, cvswmd.org. We have a home composting tab where we actually have a video. It's just a very short sped up video that shows the process of building it, and the plans, if you want to make your own, are on there as well. And you can sort of see in the back, they used to have a pallet bin and then changed to this much better made bin. And then next slide. The other piece is, I just want you to see, it's a similar design as that 3 bin system, where the sides and the back are just big pieces of hardware cloth. So the front is the same concept. It's the slats, the boards come up, and the sides are open and allowing aeration. So there's 2 kinds of aeration: the natural aeration of the air flowing through, and then the aeration that happens when the pile's turned. And I think Theron has actually tweaked this design even a little bit more since this was built. This was the prototype. Next slide, please. Tumblers. Okay, so tumblers are really good ways to compost, especially for people who maybe it's not the main thing in their life that they want to do and they just want to like make it simple, but they are actually trickier than composting in a bin. And there's things you need to know about tumblers. These two, again, the image on the bottom is a marketing image that we took off the Jora website. So forgive me for the low quality, but what I tried to show here were two versions of tumblers. One is a sort of DIY homemade tumbler, and the other is top of the line. If you can get one of these, it's really the best one out there. And I don't work for Jora and I'm not trying to sell them. I just have gone through a lot of composters and we do this for a living. And this one is the best one right now. Maybe someone will develop a better one. So the pros for tumblers are that they are completely enclosed. So they're really a great way if you want to start your composting in a tumbler. That's a great way to keep animals away. They're just not going to get into them. Even bear, we've had huge increase in bear-human interactions this year in Vermont, but it's always an issue here. And they can sometimes try to get into a tumbler. They don't get into them. They might get it off the stand or something, or knock it over, but bear even don't get into those. Now that I've said that, someone's going to email me that a bear got into their Jora. But so that part's good. But just remember, if it's fully enclosed, then it's not getting the microorganisms from the soil. So you're going to need to add a shovel full of soil every now and then to make sure. It's kind of like an inoculant. If you have a brand new tumbler, start it off with a shovel full of soil or a shovel full of your last year's compost or something to just get it started. If you have a tumbler and nothing's working in it, it's like the stuff isn't decomposing. That could be why, and you might be able to jumpstart it by just adding some soil. The other thing is, remember you need browns. A lot of people in tumblers forget that they're supposed to also add leaves or wood shavings or some other brown. The only thing I want to say is we talked about adding 2 or 3 times as many browns as food scraps or greens in a compost bin. And one exception is tumblers. In a tumbler, you only need a 1-to-1 ratio, but you do still need to add your browns. So every time you add food scraps, you add the same amount of browns in a tumbler. For me, I use wood shavings. I have a container that has, and actually you're going to see a picture of it in a minute, that just has wood shavings in it, and I have a little scoop. And every time I add my kitchen compost pail of food scraps, I throw in a scoop of browns. The other thing about these images, the top image, I have used those. I don't like that kind particularly. I really like the ingenuity of turning a 55-gallon barrel into a working composter. The problem I find with it is that it's huge and it gets too heavy to turn after a while when it fills up. The other thing I don't like about tumblers as a system alone without a different anything else in it is that a tumbler will fill up, but it may not be finished composting. So that could leave you in a little bit of a problem if you filled up your tumbler, but it's not done composting and you still have food scraps, or you have some stuff that's all the way composted and then all this new stuff you're adding. So how do you deal with that? So I think a tumbler is a really good thing to have, but just not all alone. Like if you already have a tumbler, consider also having a soil saver or some other compost bin. So when your stuff is mostly decomposed in the tumbler, you can take it out, put it in your compost bin and let it finish composting in the bin. And then it'll already be partially decomposed or mostly decomposed. So it won't attract animals in your bin because it will have already gone through most of that process in the tumbler. But it will allow you, every time you empty your tumbler, you can start over, and it gives you that option to keep it enclosed so animals don't get in. I just want to speak about the Jora for a minute. I will say up front, it is one of the most expensive tumblers on the market. So I am fully aware this is not an option for a lot of people. But if it is within your budget, it's well worth it. It's a good investment. I invested in one and I use it, and I actually ended up getting animals in my compost despite my best efforts. So I just stopped adding food scraps to my bin, and I only put them in the Jora right now, and it's working. It's ended the problem. The things about the Jora that I really like are that it has 2 chambers. You can see in this image, one door is open and one is closed. It also has latches. That's key, because if you have like a raccoon or something trying to get in, they have little mini hands. They can, but they're not gonna, you can even lock those latches if you want to. They also are insulated. They have about 4 inches of foam inside of them. And they have aeration holes that you can't see in this image. But so what you do is you start all your food scraps in one of the chambers. You remember, every time you add your food scraps, you add the same amount of browns. And every time you add it, you close the lid, latch it, turn it, and by turning it, you've aerated it. And then when that side fills up, you just leave it alone and you start filling up the second side. When you fill up the second side, the first side should be, mostly, if not fully composted, there's no recognizable food scraps in there by then, except for maybe some eggshells and avocado peels. Then you can dump that out, do something with that. I put it into my actual bin and start fresh. So you just keep rotating those bins, just like we talked about with the 2 or 3 bin system. So I think that's a great plan. There are other dual chamber tumblers out there, so that might be a feature to look for if you're looking to buy a tumbler new. And also having one that comes insulated is really helpful, because it means that the material will heat up fairly quickly in there, and that helps speed up the composting process. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about trench composting. This is one for the gardeners. This isn't for everyone, and obviously for folks who are living in Vermont, this is only an option for part of the year. But this is a good way to handle food scraps or the kinds of things that you do not want to put in your bin, like meat scraps, or we'll talk about this more later, but bear in the early spring when they come out of hibernation, they're not only attracted to meat scraps, they may be attracted by the smell of sweet fruits, and that would be things like cantaloupe or watermelon peels, strawberry hulls. So one way to manage those is in a trench compost system. And it's a fairly simple system. The first thing you do is, again, I'm speaking to the gardeners here, dig a trench in your garden, and the trench should be around 18 inches deep. You could go deeper. I said here, dig down at least 2 feet. You actually don't have to go quite that deep, but you want to dig at least 18 inches. And you make a whole trench. So you can see in these images, the soil from the digging process is piled up on the sides of the trench. And what you do is, I'm assuming everybody here has or will have some kind of a pail in their kitchen. And you dump that pail in, like usually it's every couple days. If you have, like somebody mentioned they have maggots, if you're seeing maggots in your kitchen pail, you need to be dumping that every single day. That means that either you've had rotten food in your fridge that you put in there, or sometimes fruits like citrus or bananas, or even in harvest season, some of our vegetables that we harvest come with fruit fly larvae already in it. So fruit flies can be an issue. So dump it every day, and you can put it right into the trench, and then you cover it up with that soil that you see piled on the sides and leave it. And you can even plant directly onto that, because remember, you'll have like at least a foot of soil on top of the food scraps. You can put like a starter or even seeds on top of it, and you just keep going down the trench. Maybe every day, maybe every other day, you add another bucket, you pile it up, and eventually you'll have filled in the whole trench. And that's a really great way to deal with your meat and bones, to deal with your sweet smelling food scraps, or if you just want to do that in the summer, it will decompose. You don't add browns. This isn't like a compost bin. You just put the soil on top and you forget about it, and it just decomposes underground. Next slide. Okay, green cones. So first of all, green cones are not compost bins. They're included in the slideshow because they're a great way to manage your food scraps. It's another really good system for managing meat and bones. or even pet waste, the kinds of things that you have to manage but you don't want in your compost bin. These are another fully contained system. So unfortunately, we can't really see underground. This image is of newly installed green cones, but you can see that there was digging. Underneath the cone, there is actually a fairly significant sized basket. It looks a lot like a laundry basket, but it's much sturdier. And so the basket is like full of holes, like aeration, and it's almost like a meshed fence almost. So the food scraps go into the top of the cone. You can see that there's a latch here, so you can latch it. And they decompose underground. They're a little bit like a digester. They are not composters. So you don't add browns to this. You don't aerate it. All you do is put your food scraps in and close it and forget it. And it works. There are a couple limitations. It needs full sun. It won't work if you don't have full sun. And I think about a half a day is about right. So about 8 hours of full sun. It also needs well-drained soil. And if you don't have well-drained soil, you can work around that by installing them by just digging your hole before you put it in, bigger than you need, and lining it with gravel and sand, so you create your own drainage system. But the main thing is, this is not compost. So for those of you who your goal is to keep your food scraps out of the trash, but you don't really want or need compost, this is a really good solution. And you can see in this image, there's 2 of them. It's just like the soil savers. I recommend start with 1, but eventually you're probably going to want 2, because if it's your only way you're managing food scraps, then you're going to fill up, and depending on how many people are in your family. They can, so they digest the food scraps underground. The material kind of liquefies and leaches out into the soil around it. And it actually acts sort of like a fertilizer stick. So all the soil around these cones gets very enriched. So some people will install their green cone right in the middle of their vegetable garden, or somewhere where they want to take advantage of that fertility in the soil. So that's one thing to think about, is you have this sort of double advantage with a green cone. You can still access those nutrients. It's just different than a composter. Also want to point out in this image, there is a compost bin in the back. It's kind of a funny looking one. We used to sell that particular style. It's basically a flimsy plastic with a lot of holes punched in it that fits together in a cylinder, and it has like a circle top and bottom. They're too flimsy. We don't do those anymore. And they also are fully enclosed, so you don't get the access to the soil. But you can see that's a regular compost bin. So this household installed 1 compost bin and 2 green cones. So they were, that's one option too. If you are composting, you might want a green cone just to handle everything else, the meat and bones. Some people would put dairy in there, fish scraps, and some people use it for their pet waste, like mostly dog waste. Cat waste is a lot trickier to handle. You cannot put browns in these. If you put browns in a green cone, they will stop working. I sometimes tell people, think of it as if you ate 4 bags of potato chips in one sitting, and what's going to happen with your stomach and your system after that. Everything's going to stop. That's kind of what happens in a green cone if you add browns. It just fills up and it can't process anything. So everything we said about that ratio, 3 to 1, is accurate for compost, but it's not the way to manage a green cone. The last thing I want to say before we move on is just, a green cone takes a couple hours to install. It's a little job when you get it. It's something you need to account for. If you're going to spend the money on one, make sure you have the right space with the full sun, and you can handle the soil. Make sure you can handle the job, or you have somebody who can install it for you, of digging the hole and getting it set up. Once that's done, you don't have to do anything else. They will digest your food scraps, and it will just keep working. Sometimes there's issues. There are tweaks. If it stops working, sometimes it just means the water table's high, or you need to poke a stick into it because the stuff got built up, or you might need to add an accelerator powder, which is like an enzyme that starts the process. And I want to say up front, we sell green cones, but we are out right now. So we have been inundated with people looking for green cones, and we're not able to meet that need right now. But there are websites online where you can buy them too. So do a little searching around your area, or contact your local solid waste management district if you're interested in one of those. Next slide. Okay, this is our last slide in this section about compost systems. And I promised you, like I'm sure you were all waiting with bated breath, that I'd show you an image of how I store my browns. This is it, the one on the top left. That's one of my compost bins. I have a Jora and 2 of those pre-made bins, those cylinder-shaped pre-made bins. That's how I do it. And I have this, you know, not very pretty looking, but very effective. It's just a 32-gallon Rubbermaid tote. Every now and then I'll buy a bale of wood shavings. They're about a little under $6, and you can get them at farm and garden stores. Here in Montpelier, I get mine at Guy's Farm and Yard. Tractor Supply has them too. Anywhere that sells animal bedding or products for livestock or animals will have it. And it lasts me months. One bale of wood shavings for my one family. Actually, I have a couple neighbors who contribute. So combined, it's about 3 to 4 months, depending on how often we're contributing. So if you are wondering where to get browns, if you don't have dried leaves this time of year, or you don't have like a mill near you where you can get wood shavings for free, you can buy them. It's pretty inexpensive. And so I keep that right next to the bin, and every time I add food scraps, I have my browns right there. So it's really easy to keep up with that. And then the next slide, the next picture is just the similar system somewhere else where they just had a smaller bin for their foods, for their browns. So just keep that in mind. You're going to want something, whatever it works for you, for storing your browns next to or near your compost bin. We have a question pop up: is grass clippings brown or green? That is a good question. They are green when they're green. If you mow your lawn and you have a bag full of green grass clippings, that's a green. And one thing to keep in mind, if you're going to put all the grass clippings from one mowing in your compost, that's nitrogen, and you need 3 times as many browns. So if you have a giant bag that holds like 4 gallons of your grass clippings, then you need 3 times that many browns. The other option is to let them spread them out on the ground and let them dry. And once they're dried, then they're browns, and you can use them as browns. It's literally, if they're fresh, they're greens. If they're dried, they're browns. I think we're done with this section. Can you go to the next slide, Darren, and hop on? I'm going to start looking at the questions. We have some piled up here. Okay, one person asked, can we add yard waste? Yes, you can add yard waste. That yard waste meaning like leaves, I assume, like dried leaves, even sticks. Somebody says, Shauna asks, can you layer with leaves and small branches instead of wood? Wood chips. Well, first of all, I just want to say we've been talking about wood shavings, not wood chips. Wood shavings are like sawdust. They're fine, and they'll absorb the moisture. Wood chips are much bigger. They will not absorb moisture. People use them in their compost sometimes to add aeration pockets, but they don't use wood chips for your browns. They won't work. If you're layering with leaves and small branches, that's a great way to passively aerate your pile. The small branches, or if you have a layer of wood chips, that'll just create air pockets, and then you don't have to turn your pile. You've got the aeration happening. Farron, you want to take this one? Tabia says, I'm having issues getting the carbon portion because they don't have leaves this time of year. Can I cut up cardboard boxes? Oh, here's Theron's favorite question. Use fireplace ashes or torn up brown bags?
All right, so cardboard, if it's not coated, is fine. You don't want to have wax or plastic on the outside of any paper products that you're putting in your compost because they won't break down and you'll have to pick them out later. So uncoated papers, cardboard, paper bags, those will all work if you shred them up. And ashes, you should not put in your compost. It's because they are basic, which is the opposite of acidic, and the bacteria that you want to thrive in your compost, they like it a little acidic. So if you put a lot of wood ash in, they won't like it and they will be damaged. So don't put those in your compost. If you're looking for a good source of browns, of carbon material, because Andrew mentioned the wood shavings that you can get at farm and garden stores. I also, well, personally, I go to woodworking shops or sawmills, and they often have a lot of wood shavings, like from planers and other equipment that that are a really good source of carbon, and they are just giving that stuff away for free because they need to get rid of it. So if you can find a place like that, somewhere that makes furniture or makes other wood products or processes lumber, they may be able to give you some wood shavings from their byproducts.
If you live in a rural area, sometimes used animal bedding is a great source. I have a friend who raises goats, and sometimes I'll go get some of her goat bedding. It's dry, but it has the added benefit of having a little bit of manure in it, which is really nice. It's not a full load of manure, which can be a lot to handle and not ideal for a small home compost bin, but that little amount in the goat bedding, it still acts as a brown because it's dry and it's mostly straw or hay, but it has that nice little added benefit of the extra fertility. So that's, sometimes people will be happy to let you take some of their bedding for that.
Yeah. And wood chips are a good carbon source. The only thing is that they're too big of chunks, and so they won't break down quick enough, and they won't have that same kind of moisture absorption as the smaller pieces in the wood shavings will.
So Simona asks, she wants to know what kind of paper products to add to a compost pile. So the answer to that is basically, you can use shredded paper, shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard, but if the paper has a color to it, like a yellow, green, whatever, don't use that. And nothing with a coating. Wrapping paper is a hard no, that's too glossy. No box board that has like a colorful coating on it. The inks in those coatings aren't safe for your compost, but newspaper inks are fine. The inks on like white office paper is fine. Cardboard's fine. I would stick to those three. Sometimes somebody asked earlier and I answered, and I typed in the answer if they could use Kleenex or tissues. Yes, as long as you're not getting the kind that has lotion in it. You know, those weird tissues that say that they have lotion in it, that you would not put in your compost. But yeah, you can use paper towels as long as they're just paper and they don't, if they have a stretch, then they have plastic in them. So it really has to be very basic. Only 100% paper items. Here's one for Theron. Jane says that they are adding all of their food scraps. They said, veggie scraps, tea, coffee grounds, plate scrapings, all that stuff into their bin. They're using their browns. They cover it up with straw or brown leaves, but it's not really composting. So they want to know, should they let more green stuff build up before adding the brown?
No, you really want to add the brown and the green at the same time so that it can mix properly. And you want to make sure you're aerating it. And the other thing I would do is I'd monitor how much moisture it's getting. As we mentioned before, if it gets too wet, it's going to go anaerobic. It's not going to have enough air in it, and it'll be too compacted. And if it's too dry, it'll just take a really long time to process. So that's sort of condition specific. It depends on how much sun it's getting, how well drained it is, if it's getting a lot of rain on it.
Okay, we have a lot more questions. I'm just going to take one more. And this one, Theron's going to talk about in the next section too. This person says their dried flower stems don't disintegrate. And that's because it depends on where you get them. But if you're getting flowers from a florist, from a grocery store, they're going to be treated with a fungicide, possibly an herbicide or pesticide as well. But particularly the fungicide is going to stop or slow down the composting process. So that's may be what you're seeing. And we would recommend that you keep any flowers from a florist out of your compost bin. The other thing that could be happening is that you just need to cut those stems into smaller pieces. Sometimes the tougher items like broccoli stems, celery, carrots, even eggshells and avocado peels, if you just cut them to smaller sizes, they'll compost more quickly. Okay, I'm going to hop out and let Theron take over for the next section, and we'll stop and have a Q&A when that's over.
All right, so we're going to talk about the recipe now. Let's start with the browns. So the browns are your carbon inputs. And again, you want to have 3 parts brown to 1 part green, 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Every material that you're putting into your compost, whether it's food scraps or wood shavings, is going to have a ratio of carbon and nitrogen. So that's, I mean, basically you just want to find things that are a high ratio in either direction. So wood shavings and dried leaves, straw, hay, shredded paper, these are all things that we've talked about as being good carbon sources. Nitrogen sources, that's going to be all your food scraps, green grass clippings. Cassandra said if you dry them out, they would become browns. That's true. And then garden trimmings. And you can put really any kind of garden trimmings in. If you put weeds in, especially if they've gone to seed, those seeds may not break down or process in the composting process. And you may end up with those weed seeds in your finished compost. So it's best to keep those out. You can compost those separately. And if it's just weeds and there's no food in it, you can even do that in an open pile, and that's fine. Manures, green manures are also green as in fresh. They are also really high in nitrogen. So from any sort of farm animal, cows, chickens, sheep, goats, horses, those are all great sources of nitrogen. And if you're trying to make a lot of compost, if you have a big yard and just want to make some good compost to help fertilize your gardens, you can get manure and mix it up with like wood chips. And in that case, that's, and then, mix that up and let it sit for a year. That would make compost, and that would be a really good way to help build up your soil as well. So the other thing that is important for this whole process is the size of the materials that you are working with. The smaller the pieces, the more they will interact, and the more surface area they'll have to interact. So if you have flower stalks that are really long and thick, you might consider chopping or grinding those up so that they are easier and pre-processed. Remember that these materials are being broken up ideally by insects and bugs and little microorganisms. So the smaller the pieces are, the easier a time they will have of doing that. So when you're collecting your food scraps, that can be pretty much anything that was food from your kitchen. So vegetable scraps, fruit scraps, loose tea, coffee grounds, plate scrapings, eggshells, and then any sort of uncoated, that's very important, any sort of uncoated paper products like napkins or tissues. And that is just for your home composting. If you're bringing it to a drop-off site, you should keep those things out. They can just go in the trash. That's the paper products. But if you're doing it at home, it's fine. You can put those in. So In this next image, we have some examples of how people collect food scraps in their kitchens. People will, I mean, you can use any sort of durable, washable container, whether that's a yogurt cup or a 5-gallon bucket, a metal pail, an old takeout container, whatever it is you have is fine. And we sell some nice food scrap pails to our district residents that you can use, but anything will work. We recommend something like a hard plastic or metal that is easy to wash out. And as you can see in some of these pictures, some people line their buckets or their pails in newspaper. That's fine. You can use bio bags, but there are no places, no commercial composters or food scrap drop-off sites that want those bio bags in their totes. So please keep those out. And it's really, I mean, that's just another thing to buy. If you are doing this, the easiest way is just to get one of those hard containers that you can wash out. You could have a designated brush if you want, just to scrub that, or hit it with a hose sprayer, and keep it clean. That'll keep the bugs down, and empty it frequently. We have, in our house, we have a little pail that goes on the countertop, and then we have a 5-gallon bucket in the basement. So when the countertop pail fills up, we put it in the basement, and then we only need to go to the food scrap drop-off every once in a while, maybe once a week, and that's a good system for us. For browns, again, these are things like dried leaves and sawdust, dead plants, shredded paper, paper towels. Again, if you're putting paper products in, they should be uncoated. And as I said, I use wood shavings that I get from a mill shop, and I get those in these huge bags. I don't know, they must be 100-gallon bags or something like that. And you can get those for free if you ask, and that's a good way to do it. But there are also those smaller, more manageable bales of animal bedding. It's just like pine wood shavings that you can get at the farm and yard stores, and those are a great option, especially because they're more compact, and those will last you a long time. The other thing that a lot of people do is when they're collecting their food scraps in the kitchen, they'll take a handful of those wood shavings and they'll put them in the bottom of the pail. That helps absorb some of the moisture initially and some of the smell, and it's a good way to deal with that. So some of the things we want to keep out of our compost, you can see the picture of the flowers here. Cassandra mentioned that commercial florists often treat their flowers with fungicides and insecticides, and so those you should keep out. Again, we are, as composters, trying to create an environment for these microorganisms to thrive, and if you are killing them, you're not doing that. So keep the florist flowers out. Also, anything that was never food or a plant. That includes the PLU stickers that you find on fruit, twist ties, rubber bands, and of course the meat and bones, which are exempted from the food scrap ban. You can put those in the trash or manage them with a green cone or pit composting, or you can bring them to a drop-off site. Any of that is fine. But these are the things you want to keep out. Okay. So I think Cassandra, if you want to jump on, we can take a couple more questions before we go into more details about upkeep.
Okay, thanks, Darren. A number of people have asked why not put weeds in the compost. Can you answer that?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that, but maybe you missed it. If you put weeds in the compost, especially if they've gone to seed, the seeds may not die or become inactive during the compost process. They might survive through it. And then if you take that compost and spread it on your garden, those weeds will grow. So that's the idea behind keeping weeds out.
And this is another one you have just described, but we had, and some of these questions might have come in before your section, but a number of people were asking about what are some of the options for browns. And I know you just went through the list, so maybe a one more review besides
sure.
dried leaves and wood shavings. And this person also said, and toilet paper, which I suppose you could use, but you really wouldn't count that as a brown because it's so flimsy. Why don't you just, do a review of that?
Yeah, so browns are things that are high in carbon. That's things like leaves and sawdust, dead plants, shredded paper, and then uncoated paper products like paper towels and uncoated paper plates. Shredded newspaper is fine too. You can use cardboard. I think we had somebody ask about that. Any of these dry, high carbon materials, you can see some examples in this photo here. And those are going to provide the carbon that the organisms need for their energy. So.
And somebody said they have to go early. Bye. Thank you. So Gemma has a great question that comes up every now and then. They said that they started their compost bin with red wrigglers, but they are thinking they don't need those, and that is correct. You don't need to add worms to your compost. In fact, a lot of worms, at least in the North America, are invasive species, and that's something I didn't know growing up. But in any case, they do aerate, they do decompose materials, but you don't have to add them. They're already in the soil. So if you are doing vermicomposting, which is where you basically, it's a worm bin where you just feed worms and use the worm castings for fertilizer, that's different. But if you just have a compost bin, don't worry about adding worms. They're already in the soil. And they'll find, believe me, they will find it. Okay, I think that's it for now. There's a few more questions I'm going to wait. One person asked about the turnaround time for compost to be usable, and we're going to kind of get into that in this next section.
Okay.
Okay, so upkeep. We've spent a lot of our time talking about the food part of food, air, and water. Remember, food, air, and water is for the microorganisms. Without those trillions of microorganisms, you don't have compost. There's no such thing as sterilized compost. If your compost is sterilized, it's just dirt. It's not compost. It's not going to do anything for you. So you need to feed the microorganisms with food. And by now, I think everybody knows the food is your greens, which is your food scraps or any of your green grass clippings, green weeds, green garden stuff. And it's the high nitrogen, often it's wet materials, and your browns. Those are dried materials, the carbon-based materials like dried leaves, wood shavings. That's food. We've covered that. I think you're all aware. You can't have compost without the food. But you also need to make sure you have air and water. So let's go to the next slide. We're just going to go into a little bit more detail on those. And the reason we spent most of the time talking about the food part is because, you know, the main ingredient that we're all adding to our compost bins are our food scraps. And we really want you to be able to compost your food scraps without it getting stinky and without animals coming. So that's why we really focus on that. But all of these things we're talking about, the 3 parts browns to 1 part green, the aerating the pile, the making sure it's moist enough, all combined, these are the things that are going to make it so your compost does not smell bad. If it smells bad, if you have compost that smells bad, then it doesn't have enough browns, or it hasn't been aerated, or it's too wet. So anytime there's something wrong with your compost, look to your food, air, and water, and you're going to need to adjust it. So let's talk about air or aeration. We talked earlier about how food scraps and organic materials in a landfill situation don't really decompose aerobically. They're an anaerobic. They generate methane when they decompose. In a compost bin, it's aerobic. And sometimes, if you are not turning the pile or intentionally aerating it, it will compact and it will become anaerobic. And let's have a show of hand, anyone who's ever had a compost pile just smell bad. Just really bad smelling compost pile. I'm going to bet, I'm seeing like 9 people raise their hand. I'm going to bet 10. They're slowly, people are adding on. I'm going to bet in that situation, it was wet, and maybe you were just adding food scraps and not adding browns. And what happens is it just plops down, decomposes into an anaerobic mess. And that's what's smelly. So if that happens, there's a quick thing you can do. The first thing is you go out and get your rescue wood shavings. And you might even never use wood shavings otherwise, but if you have stinky compost, get your wood shavings and really add generous amount, like 3 to 4 inches on top. That'll just block the smell and stop it. But then the next thing you have to do is you have to turn it and get that aeration happening. If you do those 2 things, there will be a smell released when you're fixing the pile, and then it will be gone. And the combination of having enough browns and aerating it will make it so you really don't even notice it's there. So the aerating can happen as a combination of having those open sides with the hardware cloth, and by you manually aerating it yourself. There are other ways people do it. Some people will put like pipes with holes in it through their compost pile, and so the air can like flow through those pipes. That's a little elaborate for me. I just prefer using a tool. This image shows a pitchfork, and a pitchfork is a really good tool to have if you're composting. It's just, the only limitation is if your compost has gotten, sort of halfway or, filling up in your bin, sometimes the pitchfork just can't get down all the way to the bottom of the pile. So in that scenario, if you're not turning your pile into a second bin and you're just aerating it within the bin it's in, use the pitchfork by all means, but you may want to invest in a special compost aerating tool. You can get them for around $25 online. There's farm and garden stores that sell them. I have yet, and I'm hoping that our hardware stores and farm and garden stores around here catch on that this is something people will buy. But so far, I have not ever seen them just for sale in a walk-in brick and mortar store. If you know anybody who runs a hardware store, tell them, stock these, please. But in the meantime, you can buy them online. They're typically around $25. Sometimes they look like augers, sometimes they look like little like metal wings that like fold up when you poke them down, and then they pull out little cores of the compost. And you can also do it by just have a stick that you push down into the pile, lift it up, push it down, lift it up, and you're creating air pockets. And that's what you need to get that airflow. Sometimes the pitchfork is really nice because a lot of the active composting happens in the center of your pile. So if you're using your pitchfork, you can move materials from the center of the pile out to the outer edges, and you might notice the materials on the outer edges of your pile might be dry and not breaking down. So you might want to get those outer materials to the center. So you're kind of not just moving things up and down and around, but you're kind of creating a goal where you want to circulate the stuff in the middle, come to the edges, the stuff in the edges go to the middle. And that works pretty well with a pitchfork. That's hard to do with a compost aerator or a stick. Also, how often do you aerate your pile? That totally depends on your goals. If you want your compost to happen more quickly, aerate it more quickly. That's pretty much the bottom line. There's no point in doing it daily. And I mean, weekly isn't necessary, but you could aerate it weekly, and that would speed up the process. And in my personal system at my house, I aerate it sometimes once a month. I pretty much don't really, I think somebody had asked earlier, and I want to get to that question now, how long from start to finish? And that is one of those questions that has no straightforward answer. Unless you're a commercial composter with a very particular recipe and system, and you know if you add these ingredients in this time and turn it on these dates, you will get compost within this period of time. But that doesn't happen in your backyard bin. I would say, to be realistic, you should plan on harvesting compost once a year. And then after you've got a system going, you might have some in the fall and some in the spring. But I don't think it's really realistic to plan on it happening any sooner than that. If it's a backyard compost bin, and you're just composting by slowly adding kitchen scraps every other day. I have seen people set up a pile specifically to create compost within a few weeks or a month. You can do that, but that's a different way of composting than what we were talking about. And you know, if you're really into it, you might want to look into that, where you have to make it a certain size. It has to be at least 3 feet by 3 feet. You have to have your, you know, certain exact amounts of greens and browns that you layer. But that's not what we're doing. We're adding our food scraps every other day or so, and then we're adding browns, and so it's kind of slowly building up. So the aerating process is really up to you. I want those of you who aren't that interested in a lot of maintenance of your pile, don't worry about it. Just aerate it when you can. Just make sure you don't let it get stinky. That might be a once a month poke it with a stick kind of thing. If you're a gardener and you really want to make sure you have a compost for your garden as soon as you can, I would say, you know, aerate it once a week. And if you're doing that and you're adding regularly, you'll probably be able to harvest compost twice a year. That's the, you know, I wish I could tell you it happened sooner, but it probably won't. Looks like someone's dropping off. That's okay. Thank you very much. Let's go on to the next slide. We're going to talk about water. This is one we haven't really gone into detail at all about, but this is important also. Mostly the water, the moisture in your compost bin comes from your food scraps. They're pretty wet. And if you have any experience emptying a kitchen pail full of food scraps, you'll know that usually there's a little liquid on the bottom. That's normal, that's fine. It's good that your food scraps are liquidy. That creates most of the moisture you need in your pile. But you know, there are times, like we've had a drought in Vermont for a while this summer. So without natural rainfall, your pile could get too dry. And when it doesn't have enough water, the microorganisms stop being active and the compost doesn't happen. Pardon me. It's allergy season for me around here. So there is a really, the way you monitor water is really, it's visual. And it's visual, and you can tell by picking up your compost and squeezing it in your hand. If it looks dry, it's probably dry. But you can also scoop up a handful, and I don't mind doing it with my bare hands. If you do, just put on a rubber glove. And you know, I'm not talking about scooping up a handful of gross food scraps. I'm talking about the actual composted material, and just squeeze it in your fist. If you open your fist and it's like dry and crumbly and falling off your hand, then it's too dry and you should add water. And by adding water, I'm not going to tell you a specific amount. Sometimes I spray it down with the hose for a minute or so. And then and if it's still dry the next day, I'll spray it down again. You can use, if you keep maybe a 5-gallon bucket under your eaves and it fills up with rainwater, you have something like that, you just throw the 5-gallon bucket on. If you do the squeeze test, you squeeze the compost in your hand and it's like, you know, like muddy and runny, then it's too wet. If it's too wet, add more browns to absorb the moisture and leave it alone. And make sure it's covered. So if it's raining a lot, it's not going to soak your compost even more. And the way to know if it's just right is if you squeeze it and the material holds together and it's around, this is an approximation, but if it's about the dampness of what you would see in like a squeezed out wet sponge, like a damp sponge, then it's about right. And usually it'll hold together and it will be damp, but it won't be wet. That's perfect. That's how it will be most of the time. But just know that if it looks dry, add water. If it's dry, add water. If it's wet, add browns or leave it alone. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to talk about animals. And Theron and I were both, most of the information about bears I've gotten from the Vermont's bear biologist, Forrest Hammond, over the years. And this morning, Theron and I were sitting in on a meeting with him, and pretty much everything he's told us already remains the same. So I'm going to go through this slide to talk about animals. First of all, the other thing is Vermonters have had a huge uptick in bear-human interactions. They call them conflicts, but they call it a conflict, but a conflict might be someone sees a bear and they call Fish and Wildlife. That's not a conflict. They saw a bear. that didn't hurt anybody. So, but we're calling them interactions. So the number one thing that is attracting bears is bird feeders, which I think everyone already knows. There's a couple other factors this year that is different than last year. I'm not going to go into those unless someone asks a question about it. But the main thing you can do if you don't want bears in your yard is keep your bird feeders down during their active months, which is approximately between March and November. And it's really like there's no amount of bird watching that's worth it to attract a bear to your yard, because once the bear comes to your yard, it will also go to your neighbor's yard and it will keep coming back. So if you haven't done it, take down your bird feeders. Or you might have taken down your bird feeders, but your neighbor didn't. So that's the other issue. If they're coming in because they're getting a food source, they are going to check out the neighborhood. They have an incredibly strong sense of smell. They can smell the concentrated protein in birdseed from 1 or 2 miles away. So they're going to come in if they smell it. And if your neighbor 2 doors down has a bird feeder up, once they come into an area, then they might smell like the next number one thing they are attracted to is garbage cans. So they might smell your garbage can and tip it over and root through it. The next thing farther down the list is a compost bin, and they do get into compost, but that is not the thing that is bringing them in from the woods, and is nowhere near the top thing that is attracting them. So some of the ways you can keep them out of your compost bin are exactly what we've been talking about for the past hour and a half. Make sure you're using 3 times as many browns as greens, always. And make sure you're aerating your pile. Keep the meat out of your backyard bins because meat has a stronger smell, and that can be more of an attractant. The other thing that is a more likely scenario is that the bear hasn't had any negative experience. If it's come through your property before, it may be coming through regularly. Can I see a show of hands for anybody who's had a bear just kind of like be on the same route? Yeah. So if you have a bear that's coming back, that means that bear has come through, found food, and they're coming back for it. And nobody has yelled at them. Nobody has made a loud noise. There's no bad smells. So that's positive. You want it to be negative. So you're smarter than the bear. That's one thing we learned from Forrest today. There's a lot of ways you can repel them. One of them is this ammonia trick, number 5 here. You just soak a rag in ammonia. I just found out today you can use straight up ammonia, but you could use any household cleaner. It could be bleach, it could be, whatever kitchen stuff you're spraying on your counters. Soak a rag in it, leave it in a bucket. That really does repel them. And Theron and I have done an anecdotally, we've asked when we've heard of bear sightings if folks have had that rag soaked in ammonia or cleaner in their backyards. And every time that we hear of someone who's seen a bear in their yard, they have not been doing that. So that's an easy thing to do, and it's inexpensive. You want to fill in some of the things Forrest said today, Theron?
Yeah, sure. So this year is a particularly big bear year. There are more bears because last year was a good year for bear food, and this year is a scarce year for bear food. So they're out looking for food, which has led to a lot more interactions and sightings. Aside from that, the ammonia and household cleaner trick is good. I've used that. I have a 2-bin system that I started this year. And so I have 1 bin with food scraps and wood shavings in it. And then the other bin, I have a bucket with ammonia and a rag in it. And the bear has not bothered it. Even though I have seen the bear coming through the yard on trail camera. So I can confirm that works. The other thing that Forrest talked about was the use of electric fencing, specifically baited electric fencing. A lot of people who have beehives or chickens or other livestock will have electric fencing, and they'll put some peanut butter on the electric fence or something like that, so that if if there's a bear around, it'll go and it'll lick that peanut butter, it'll get a zap on the tongue, and it won't come back. So that, he said, was very effective as well. And then the other thing that we generally recommend is using urine. That you can use some sort of predator urine, whether that's coyote or human, or hot pepper also. And that is also an effective deterrent for a lot of animals.
Okay. So yeah, there's so much to it, but the bears are the big thing we're hearing about in Vermont, but there's a lot of other mammals that are going to be interested in your bin, and snakes, actually. Snakes too. Snakes won't hurt it, by the way. They're not fun to step on or see maybe, but they will actually aerate it. The hardware cloth, the 3 times as many browns as greens, the aerating your pile, those are the main strategies for keeping animals and smells out of your bin. But if you still have animals for whatever reason, maybe they figured out a way to get through your hardware cloth, or maybe they chewed a hole in the lid or something. A couple other things you can do. Some people will buy predator urine, like there's a website called predatorpee.com. You can go there and buy predator pee. I'm a little suspicious of it personally, because like, how are they getting this predator pee? It seems a little weird, but it supposedly works. So you might want to do a little research. Another little trick that works, but you have to reapply regularly, is having some bulk amounts of hot powdered cayenne pepper or something like that. You can sprinkle it around your pile and on top of it. It's a deterrent, and it needs to be reapplied regularly, but it really is most effective if you're doing everything else. The hardware cloth lined bins, the 3 times as many browns as greens, the aerating. Did you notice that we've repeated that a lot? Because those are the things that really work. I think we've pretty much covered managing animals. The main thing is to just, if you have a bin and an animal's getting into it, you might have to move your compost into a wheelbarrow or bucket or something and look hard at where your hardware cloth is and how it's working. And it might mean you take an hour or 2 to just fix that. That's the other thing, is don't be afraid if you have to just take it apart, fix it, and put it back together. I think we're done with this section. Let's move on to our Q&A. We have a few questions that have piled up. So I'm gonna start going down the list. One person asks, how can you tell if the compost is ready for use? That's a really good question. How can you tell? Do you want to take this one, Theron?
Yeah, sure. So Cassandra talked about the squeeze test, and that's helpful for a number of reasons. But what you want to look for is all the food scrap material broken down, or are there still chunks in there? If there's really no recognizable food or carbon inputs anymore, if it's all broken down into what looks like a nice rich soil, that is fully composted compost. And there may be a couple of pieces of things that are particularly hard to process, like corn cobs or avocado shells or something like that. And you can pick those out or screen them out. But basically, you're looking to see if all of the materials you've put in there have been fully processed. And if they have been, and it looks like a nice sort of dark, rich soil, that's fully processed compost.
Yeah, and sometimes, like, I'm not picky. I don't screen mine, so sometimes I will find a part of an avocado peel or pit or
an eggshell.
Or eggshell. That doesn't bother me, but some people, they really don't like that, so they will screen it. And all you have to do is take like a 1/2-inch hardware cloth and nail it to like a square of wood, and set that up over a wheelbarrow or some other container, and you just shovel the compost onto that and shake it. And anything that didn't completely decompose, just put back in the bin and give it more time.
Yep.
But that's a personal preference, that part. Okay, so Somebody asks if food scraps are moldy before they go in the compost. Is that okay? Yes, mold is great for the compost. Don't worry about that. This is a question that comes up a lot. Does sawdust work the same as wood shavings? Yeah, wood shavings and sawdust are the same thing, basically. Wood shavings are a little bigger, but they both are, sawdust sometimes can be very fine. So I would just be aware of that and be aware if it starts to like pack together, it might not be as effective as wood shavings. So you might need to just break it up a little bit.
Yep.
This person, Janelle, asks, any tips on storing finished compost over the winter? Do you want to take that one, Theron?
Well, if you have finished compost, you can add it. You can leave it in your bin if you're not going to be needing your bin for something else. You can just leave it in there all winter. That's why it's nice to have a 2-bin system so that you can have one where you're letting the compost cure, and then you have one where you're adding new material. If you want, you can also take that compost out and just cover it in a tarp. If it's fully processed, there's not going to be food in there, and animals aren't going to want to get in there. It's really only the food that they're after. And once it's fully composted, it's pretty much just soil. So it's fine to store outside. I would cover it because some of the nutrients can get washed out with snow and rain and stuff. Or you could even, if you have finished compost and it's fall, you can dress your garden beds with it, or your lawn, and that'll fertilize it and sort of get it ready for the spring when it's going to grow again.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I will, I change my compost bins every 6 months. So when I'm getting ready for the winter, usually around here, that's pretty early, but sometime around November, before we get a hard freeze, I will empty all of my material that I've been composting all summer and fall, and I'll turn that into my second bin. And then that I just cover and I leave for the winter like that. So it's mostly finished compost, but some of it is still finishing, and it sits all winter long in that covered bin. And in the spring, it's all done. And sometimes there's a little more composting that has to happen, but pretty much that, just sitting over the winter is enough, and I can use it in the spring. And then conversely, all the stuff that I've been composting all winter, I'll switch the bins, and that stuff is then almost finished compost at that point. So that's another way of doing it, is just sort of managing it seasonally. Okay, one person asks how to get rid of fire ants. We're not going to go down that path because that's not necessarily compost related, but I wish you luck. Nikki wants to know if it's okay to add dairy, and yes, in small quantities. Every now and then, like just recently, for some reason, I had a bunch of yogurt in my refrigerator that had been there 6 months. Apparently, I'm not eating yogurt anymore. And my son put it all in the compost. That's fine. I'm not adding dairy every day. Usually, dairy waste is minimal. Who leaves cheese on the plate? There's very minimal dairy typically. If you have large quantities of dairy that's going into the compost, probably that you're better off not doing that. But the small amount of scraps in a normal household situation are fine.
And I want to add that that dairy is totally fine to bring to a food scrap drop-off.
Yes, thank you.
So if you're worried about it attracting animals or anything like that, you can always bring it to a community compost site or a commercial composter or one of those transfer stations with the food scrap drop-off tote.
And one person, this is a very Vermont, this might not be from Vermont, but a lot of Vermonters have old pipes or funky septic, and not everyone flushes their toilet paper. So this person doesn't flush toilet paper because they have old pipes. They want to know if that's okay to put in the compost. I would be a little careful about that because it's probably fine, but if you're getting into human manure, that's a whole different composting system. And I don't know, I don't want to go too deep into that now, but I would say be careful and maybe let your compost sit for 2 years before using it. But you might want to do a little bit more research into that. That's not something that we go too deep into. Just be aware that look up human manure. It's different. It's a different kind of composting, and that's not exactly what you're talking about, but it's sort of edging into that territory. Okay, Theron, MC has a tumbler with a handle. They're asking if turning the handle around, which I'm assuming means turning the actual tumbler, does it mean I am aerating it?
Well, it sounds like, well, I'm not familiar with that kind of system. If you have a tumbler and you're rotating the whole thing, that will be moving the material around and aerating it. I don't know if the handle is connected to something inside or if it's just to turn the system. So I can't really answer that, but.
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, if you look, if it's turning some kind of mechanism inside the composter, then yes. If it's moving around the material inside, yes, it's aerating it. Whether you're turning the actual bin or whether, but if you're not sure, just look inside your bin and, see what it looks like. And I'm pretty sure if it's a tumbler, it's getting aerated every time you move it though.
Yeah. The material, if you're aerating it, should be moving around like clothes in a washing machine. I mean, it should be, getting tossed around and sort of fluffed up.
Fluffed up. Okay, this is a good question. Mickey asked, how long does it take with a Jora to finish compost? And it's just like any other composting, it depends. But I have been pretty excited about my little Jora that I've been using. The Joras come in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. And I don't have the volumes for each size memorized, but the small is typically the right size for a single household. And the larger they get, the more multiple households can add to them, and it has enough space. We use the medium and larges in conjunction with those 3-bin systems at our community composting sites. But in my small Jora, with just I have my household and a couple neighbors contribute, I'm finding that the material gets pretty hot. I'm just using a combination of shredded paper and wood shavings. And it gets hot quickly. It doesn't get hot enough to qualify as thermophilic composting, which is a very specific temperature range. It gets to about 120 degrees. But it's starting to look like composted material, no longer recognizable as food scraps within a few weeks, but it's not finished composting. So within a few weeks, it's decomposed enough that I don't recognize the food scraps, but then I'm taking it out of the Jora and finishing it in my compost bin. If you want to use a Jora, just only a Jora, not in combination with something else, you probably need to give it a couple months or maybe 5 or 6 weeks, depending on how much material you're adding, how quickly. But the bottom line is it depends. We're getting, I don't know if we're over time. I haven't looked at the clock recently. Oh, we still have a few more minutes. Okay, Theron, Shauna wants to know if composted material can kill dogs and cats. And I just want to clarify, composted material does not kill dogs and cats. What I was talking about was material, food scraps that are in the process of decomposing and have a certain mold on them. And that mold has a neurotoxin in it. So maybe that's just semantics, but anyway, if it's in an open bin and a dog gets into it, yes, the dog could get harmed or die. So this person asks, if that's the case, can they kill other wildlife like raccoons or bears? And I don't feel qualified to answer that. I think the answer is yes, but I'm not sure if you have an answer for that, Theron.
I don't know.
Yeah, I would say let's be precautionary. You might want to call your local fish and wildlife department and ask them.
Generally speaking, though, we want to try to keep animals out of our compost. And the best way to do that is to use an enclosed system and make sure you're adding browns and aerating it frequently.
Okay, I think we're about done. We had one last person wanting to know, I don't fully understand this question. Alana asks, would vermicomposting allow for faster harvest? And I started to type in an answer. Vermicomposting is not composting. You're basically farming worms. You start with red wrigglers and you feed them your food scraps and then you harvest their poop. That's not exactly the same thing as composting. It's very, very potent and effective fertilizer for plants. But typically it doesn't really handle all of your food scraps. There's only so much worms can eat, and there may be only so many worms that you're going to want in your house. So and it's not necessarily faster than compost either to get the volume to harvest. I would say look into vermicomposting if you're interested in it, but it's really more like a supplement than replacing composting, unless you're somebody who's going to create a huge worm bin that you keep in your basement and I used to actually include vermicomposting in this presentation, and I took it out because it just is a little bit tricky. You know, sometimes invasive worms can get in with the red wrigglers. That can be problematic. If you don't give them their food scraps regularly, they'll climb out of the bin to find them. And if you forget about it for a week, you're going to come and open to you're going to come down to where your worm bin is, and you're going to find little dead worms all around, like an explosion of worms. So there's enough problematic things that I don't really teach it in the class, but I do say if you're interested in it, you should just, look it up online and get some good info, because it's kind of cool, but it's not technically compost. Lauren says, thank you. I will leave now. Bye. Thank you. Last thing is, a couple of people throughout the webinar have asked for a recording, and we will be sending out a recording in a follow-up email. I can't tell you if it's going to be today or tomorrow or next week, but it will be within a few business days. Everyone who registered gets that email with the link to the recording and some handouts that we link to in that as well. So thank you all very much. And I really appreciate it. We've been getting a lot of nice messages coming through on the chat with people thanking us and saying goodbye as they log off. That's very nice. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for all your questions. And happy composting.